Hello, class. I'm so happy to be back with you all today. I hope that everyone's case study writing went well, and I'm looking forward to returning feedback on all of your writing. I hope you enjoyed that assignment, and I hope that you are enjoying and learning from the class so far. In preparation for the midterm, which is coming soon, we are going to have a series of mini lectures about some important concepts in critical race theory. A lot of these we've already touched on, either in prior lectures, or you've seen video, or you've actually read, if you've been keeping up with your readings as you should, have read about some of these concepts. Not only that, you've commented on them in the discussion posts. So much of this is not new to you. However, I want to contextualize some of the things that you've been learning and really help you look at them with fresh eyes and from a new perspective if you haven't been doing so already. So, the lecture notes, the PowerPoint that I'm going to use, you already have this on your Blackboard. However, I may change some things around from time to time. And if I do, I'll be sure to send out those links for you or send out a new slides for you if necessary. But for today, not much has changed, not anything worth mentioning today. So we'll be talking about the central tenets of critical race theory. And there are two tenets that we are going to discuss today. We're going to talk about race as a social construction. We'll talk about that for quite some time. And then we'll talk about racism as ordinary, the ordinariness of racism. This lecture won't be too long, but as always, after it's over, if you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to reach out as you've been doing on Blackboard or email. I'm so happy to talk to you, and I loved discussing these concepts with those of you who I've already talked to. So, some central tenets of critical race theory, some things that underlie critical race theory, all of the ideas that really make critical race theory the profound theory that it is, those are the things that we're going to talk about. The most important things. Again, with any theory, you're going to have people within that school of thought that disagree. But there are some central ideas that the majority, if not all, of critical race theorists agree on. First is that race is a social construction. Race is a social construction. Critical race theory embraces the concept that has been well established by science that race is a biological myth that has evolved into a sociological fact. So even though we're theorizing here, there is a factual underlying that comes from scientific evidence. There is no scientific evidence for race. Race is not biological. Race is not genetic. That is well established by science. There is no gene that makes one a Black person. There is no gene that makes one a white person or any other race as these categories are labeled in society. Race is a biological myth, an incorrect idea that has persisted over time for so long that many people just accept it as fact. But race is not genetic, it's not biological, and it was neither invented by God nor nature. This doesn't mean that race isn't important. It just means that race has, because it is a biological myth, it has evolved into a sociological fact. In society, in our communities, we talk about race as if it's unquestionable. We talk about race, you look at a person and you say, that person is a certain race. For sociological purposes, for grouping, for categorizing, even for connection and community, race is something that is often used and is often important. Do not confuse that with race being a biological or genetic fact, which it is not. This means, succinctly put, that racial construction cannot be substantiated by science. There is nothing in science that can substantiate race. But as we have noted, this does not mean that race isn't central. It doesn't mean that race isn't significant. It certainly doesn't mean that race isn't an impactful aspect of the way that we have organized our society, in the way that we have grouped ourselves as human beings, in the way that the powers that be, the government and the institutions, group us and treat us. They definitely do it according to race. But note that it is a biological myth. There is nothing biological about race, but it is certainly a sociological truth. Race is not a natural phenomenon. It is not found in human biology. It's a sociological tool used by society to group people, to organize people for various reasons, whether that be according to the awarding of scholarships, whether that be according to the distribution of resources, whether that be because of some discriminatory practice, which it often is. But again, that doesn't change the fact that race is not natural. It's not found in human biology. It's a sociological tool to organize individuals. And as we will talk about, to organize individuals for the benefit of the dominant class, of those in power. That is what it means when we say race is a social construction. Social construction, know this definition, is a concept or idea based on the collective views, based on the ideas of the group that is developed within society by human beings, and that is maintained within society by human beings or by social groups through cultural or social practice. We make race real because we operate in such a way that race is real. We make it socially relevant because we operate in a way that says that it is socially relevant. We organize ourselves in a way that says it is socially relevant. There are hierarchies in society and groups in society that make race socially relevant. But that does not mean that it exists inherently. That does not mean that it exists innately or naturally. That does not mean that it is biological. It only means that it is social and cultural. It is a social fact, a sociological tool that comes from a biological myth. And so, if you've just got about 3 minutes, we will watch this video about the myth of race. And if you've already seen this, feel free to go ahead and fast forward. And I'm going to send out this video. I don't believe that this is the same link that is in the video on the PowerPoint that you have on Blackboard. And so I will send this out in a moment, but I do believe this is on your syllabus. And I hope everyone can see it. I'm just going to stop screen sharing here for a minute and then screen share again, just to ensure that everyone can see it. And I'm going to also make sure that I am sharing sound. Just give me 1 second to do that. I am not the most technologically savvy, as I'm sure you guys may know. All right, we're going to share screen and sound. And if for some reason I am so technologically inept that you guys can't get this, I will make sure that I send it out. And I would encourage you to watch it again. Don't look at all my tabs. I will encourage you guys to watch it again.
Overdraft fees are another reason banking with Capital One is an even easier decision than this.
We need a clutch hit. Derek. Jeter.
Hang in there, rookie.
Yep, even easier than that. What's in your wallet?
You may think you know exactly what race you are, but how would you prove it if someone disagreed with you? The fact is, even though race drives a lot of social and political outcomes, race isn't real. One of the first people to attempt to categorize humans according to race was a German scientist around 1776. He came up with 5 different groups according to physical appearance and geographic origin of their ancestors. Americans of European descent eagerly bought into this type of thinking around the same time. Some historians have said the idea that there were different races helped them resolve the contradiction between a natural right to freedom and the fact of slavery. If whites were their own distinct category, then they could feel a lot better about denying freedom to people who they labeled black and decided were fundamentally different.
If I could just stop there for a moment, remember that we talked earlier about how racism is the father of race and not the other way around. So you see here that certain rights were denied to certain people. Certain people were denied certain rights, certain access, and certain freedoms. That is material determinism. Some people were allowed access to wealth, to money, to the basic necessities of life, and other people were not. And in order to justify that, people created race in order to have a justification for the way certain people were treated. And the person in this video puts it very well when they say, perhaps it made people feel a little bit better. If we can pretend that there's something naturally inferior about Black people, then it's okay to use them for money or to enslave them for capitalistic gain. We'll continue.
But as political priorities change, definitions of race in America adjust right along with them. For example, if you were of Mexican birth or ancestry in the United States in 1929, you were considered white. Then the 1930 census changed that to non-white to limit immigration. Later, when the U.S. needed to increase its labor force during World War II, these people were switched back to white. And what it took to be Black once varied so wildly throughout the country.
Before we talk a little bit about what it meant to be Black or what it took to be Black, or listen to the way that they put it in this video, many of you Latino students have wrote to me, Professor McDonough, I don't really feel comfortable checking any of these boxes. I don't feel comfortable checking white. I don't know what to check, but I guess I'm white because that's all that was there. If you look at that brief history that was noted, you're not confused for no reason. You're not confused for, it's likely that your parents' racial identity has changed. If you were born before 2000, your racial identity has changed. And depending on when you were born, it may have changed multiple times, especially in the case of your parents or grandparents. So the fact that you're confused about your race, Latinos, has historical roots. There are reasons. It's because the definition of what it meant and means to be Latino or to be Hispanic, and whether or not Mexican people were white or Black, or whether Latinos were white or Black, that definition has changed over the years. That definition has changed over the years, depending on what the United States needed, depending on what the needs of the dominant class are. That is what we call, we'll talk about it more, differential racialization. Race changes and varies depending on what time period you're in, where you are geographically, and most importantly and overarching, the needs of the dominant class. And we'll see that it wasn't just Latinos who this happened to. Of course, African Americans, the definition of what it meant to be Black changes over time as well, and according to geographic location.
From 1/4 to 1/16 to the infamous 1 drop of African ancestry, that people could actually change races just by crossing state lines. Then suddenly in 2000, the government decided that Americans could be more than one race and added a multiracial category to the census. This has left many Americans scratching their heads when it comes to selecting who they are. As many as 6.2% of census respondents selected some other race in a 2010 survey. The idea that someone might look one way and identify another way, or that they might be really hard to place in a racial category, is not new. This is why there was a public debate about whether MSNBC's Karen Finney could say she was Black, or how we can't even agree on the racial label assigned to the President of the United States. Of course, many people feel their racial identity is very clear and very permanent. But the fact that some people have changed theirs and that no one can really argue with them shows how shaky the very idea of race is. This is all because there isn't a race chromosome in our DNA that people can point to. It simply doesn't exist. When the medical community links race to health outcomes, it's really just using race as a substitute for other factors, such as where your ancestors came from or the experiences of people who may have been put in the same racial group as you. Dorothy Roberts explains that sickle cell anemia is a prime example of this. The disease is linked to areas with high rates of malaria, which include some parts of Europe and Asia in addition to Africa. It's not actually about race at all. This, of course, does not mean that the concept of race isn't hugely important in our lives. The racial categories to which we're assigned can determine real-life experiences, they can drive political outcomes, and they can even make the difference between life and death. But understanding that racial categories are made up can give us an important perspective on where racism came from in the first place.
And
I've
that,
been getting paid $1,000 a
I believe, is a pretty good explanation and debunking of the myth of race. That's a pretty good debunking of the myth of race. So again, if you like that video, if you want to share it with your friends and family, I would encourage you to, and I will send it out just after this lecture is over. And just look at this little note here that says, race as we know it has no deterministic biological basis. All the same, race is so powerful that it can have life or death consequences. That is such a paradox. That is such a contradiction. How can something that's so made up, something that's so unnatural, something that we know has no genetic or biological basis, literally have life or death consequences? That is why we study race. That is why we know that race is so important. But in doing that, we have to acknowledge that it is not a biological or natural concept. It's so important for you to understand that race is socially constructed. And knowing that it's socially constructed and knowing that it exists and is so important in our lives, despite the fact that it is not natural or biological, leads us to another important tenet of critical race theory, something that critical race theorists insist that we must understand, that racism is ordinary. When we think about racism, we think about people saying the N-word. We think about people using racial slurs. We think about people discriminating on the basis of race. And it's those vile and disgusting things that we think about when we think about racism. But that's just scratching the surface of what racism is. Those are effects of racism in society, and we can talk about those, and they matter and they're important. But critical race theory wants us to understand that racism is a structural concept. Racism is a system. It is a method of organizing people. It is a method of dividing people. And it is a method and a system that has existed since the very foundations of this country. Racism is nothing new. Literally, as the founding fathers were declaring and putting in writing for ages to exist, for ages to come, that all men were created equal, all men, but all men were created equal, they literally owned men and women and their children. They literally owned slaves. And so they could not have meant that all men were created equal, because they knew, in fact, that all men were not equal. So even if they believed that all men from birth were equal, they had to also believe or justify the fact that they could still own people. They knew that this was wrong. They knew that racism was unfathomable, but they still did it because it was a system of organization. It was a useful system of organization for them to achieve material prosperity, material determinism. The ownership of slaves provided capitalistic gains, provided money, provided wealth, was the foundation of the system, of the economic system. Slavery was the foundation of the economic system of the United States of America. And racism is the way that people were organized, with some people on top, some people on bottom, and people everywhere in between. It is a system of classification of people. And so racism is normal. It's ordinary. That is a tenet of critical race theory. When we adopt a critical perspective, of the concept of race, we are able to now move beyond this well-established biological myth and move beyond this also myth that racism is somehow abnormal. If race is a historical tool that we have employed to organize society for hundreds and hundreds of years, then there is nothing exceptional about racism. There's nothing exceptional about racism. There is nothing isolated or personal about racism. So in so many ways, class, we have to stop taking this idea of racism so personally and realize that it is not exceptional. It is not anything new. It is not anything weird. We have to stop looking at race so personally. You are a racist. I am a racist. As I will tell you, spoiler alert on the next slide, we are all racists. Not because we're all bad people, not because we all use racial slurs, not because we all hate people of other races. We don't. That's not what makes us racist. What makes us racist is that we organize ourselves knowingly and unknowingly according to race. And we are all part of a system where people are classified and put in hierarchies and divided into in-groups and out-groups according to race. We all participate and partake of that society, knowingly and unknowingly, willingly and unwillingly. And that means that we are all racist. We often imagine that the nation's racial conflict is caused by a few ignorant bad apples who somehow suffer from a moral deficiency. These people are bad. And from this perspective, we would say racism and racist individuals are extraordinary. They're extraordinary. This is a bad police officer who murdered George Floyd. He's a bad person. But racism is not extraordinary. It is not anything new. The system of violent policing against Black people is part of the racist system. It's part of the hierarchy. It's part of the classification. And it has so little to do with the individual heart and mind, and so much to do with the system in which we live. Racism is ordinary. This is the type of racism we recognize, right? Give me a KKK hood, I can see it. Give me a Confederate flag. They celebrate the owning of slaves. They celebrate the inferiority or inferior treatment of people of color. They celebrate. This is the racism we recognize. But this is not the racism that critical race theory is so deeply concerned with. Racism is ordinary. When we consider the history that we talked about a little bit in this lecture, the history of the concept of race, it becomes abundantly clear that racism is quite ordinary and quite normal. Racist concepts, attitudes, and practices have served as a method of organization, have served as a way to organize society for years. Racist ideas are infused into every institution. That's why we talk about policing. It's not to insult police officers. That's why we talk about healthcare and education and the criminal justice system. It's not to insult judges and lawyers. It is to say that racist ideas, ideologies, practices are infused into every institution, every opportunity, and every person. That's why we ask you these discussion questions, so you can think about the way that racism has been infused in you from such a young age. Racist ideas are infused, embedded, woven into every institution, opportunity, and person in American society. Our country was literally founded, literally built on the idea of race as a means of effectively implementing racism. The foundations of our country is this black and white dichotomy, this slave and free dichotomy, this system of classification. It was built on the idea of race as a means of effectively implementing racism. Racism is so ordinary that we are all racist. Did you know you were a racist? We are all racist. What we are dealing with in critical race theory is the racism that we don't see, the ordinary racism, not the kind that comes from being a bad apple, the ordinary racism, the kind we don't see, the kind that is embedded, woven, infused into the systems and structures under which we all operate. So yeah, we definitely need to start by acknowledging our own privileges, acknowledging our own racist attitudes. But we need to see what we can do about those systems and those structures in which racism is embedded, woven, and infused. And that's where we'll stop today. I've already held you too long. That's where we will stop today. If you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for taking the class. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I can't wait to talk to you soon. All right, bye-bye.